4 women took one look at Godfrey's ruined face and caught the next stagecoach east. They usually wept. Sometimes they dry-heaved into the dirt. It was a brutal, predictable rhythm of hope and humiliation out here in the jagged Wyoming peaks. He figured the 5th would do exactly the same. Half his jaw looked like melted wax, a grotesque tapestry of burnt flesh. But Martha didn't scream. She just wiped the sweat from her heavy brow, pointed at her massive trunk, and asked which wagon was his. Whiskey, stale tobacco, and the sharp tang of horse manure, thick in the July heat. Those were the smells of Bitter Creek, a town that felt less like a settlement and more like a scab on the edge of the frontier. Godfrey stood under the slanted awning of the mercantile, intentionally keeping his left side buried in the shadows. He possessed a grim familiarity with this routine. The mail-order bride catalogue was a lie both parties agreed to participate in. The men lied about their wealth. The women lied about their pasts. Godfrey, however, had told the truth. He had paid Jaden Cobb, the greasy broker who managed the deliveries, extra to explicitly state, disfigured, mountain property, rough conditions. Cobb had promised a sturdy woman this time, a woman who understood hardship. The stagecoach rattled down the main thoroughfare, kicking up a blinding cloud of dried mud and pulverized rock. It shuddered to a halt in front of the depot. Godfrey's stomach tightened, a familiar, humiliating coil of dread settling just beneath his ribs. His hand rose instinctively to his jaw. The skin there was tight, slick, and ridged, a permanent reminder of a blasting cap that had gone off prematurely in a copper mine 6 years ago. It had taken half his cheek, part of his ear, and left his left eye permanently pulled downward in a grotesque droop. Jaden Cobb swung down from the driver's bench, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. He wiped a grimy hand across his mouth and walked around to the coach door. Godfrey stepped out from the awning. The noon sun offered no mercy, illuminating every jagged contour of his face. He braced himself for the gasp. He waited for the sudden step backward, the panicked flutter of a parasol, or the immediate flood of tears. The coach door swung open. A heavy boot emerged, searching blindly for the iron step. Then came the woman. She did not glide out of the carriage. She hauled herself out. Martha was a massive woman. Her broad shoulders strained the seams of a plain, faded blue cotton dress that had clearly been let out at the waist more than once. Her hips were wide, her chest heavy, and as she stepped down, the carriage springs groaned in a loud, metallic protest. She planted her feet in the dirt, visibly out of breath, a sheen of sweat instantly gathering on her upper lip and the deep folds of her neck. Godfrey stood paralyzed. She was easily 250 pounds, maybe more. Her face was flushed dark red from the stifling heat of the coach's interior. Wisps of damp brown hair plastered themselves to her cheeks. She looked exhausted, irritable, and profoundly uncomfortable. She turned her head. Her gaze locked onto Godfrey. He stopped breathing. Here it comes, he thought. The scream, the horror. Martha's flat, muddy brown eyes scanned his face. They moved over the melted flesh of his cheek, the twisted ruin of his ear, and the pulled socket of his eye. She stared for a long, uncomfortable 3 seconds. Then she blinked. You Godfrey? Her voice was thick, slightly raspy from the road dust, lacking any trace of delicate femininity. I am, Godfrey managed to say. His own voice sounded like grinding stones. Martha reached up with a thick, capable hand and wiped the sweat from her forehead using the back of her wrist. Sun's hot enough to fry an egg on a rock. You got a wagon, or are we walking? Cobb sidled up, a nervous, ingratiating smile plastered on his face. Mr. Weaver, as promised, Miss Martha Chavez. Strong as an ox, this one. No fuss, no delicate sensibilities. He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of sour mash. She ain't much to look at, but you ain't exactly a painting yourself, eh? Good match? Godfrey ignored Cobb entirely. His single good eye remained fixed on Martha. She wasn't looking at him with pity. There was no revulsion. She was simply looking at the large oak barrel of water situated outside the depot. "My trunk is in the boot," Martha said, not waiting for a formal introduction. "It's heavy. Has my cast-iron pans in it. I don't trust other people's cookware." Godfrey walked past her, the scent of her hitting him. Sweat, yes, but also a faint trace of lavender lye soap and old paper. He moved to the back of the coach and hauled the trunk out. It was shockingly heavy, the leather straps biting deep into his calloused hands. He grunted, hoisting it onto his right shoulder to keep the pressure off his scarred side. "Wagon's this way," he muttered, turning his back on her. He expected to hear her hesitate. He expected her to demand to go inside the depot to rethink her life choices. Instead, he heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of her boots following right behind him. The buckboard wagon bounced violently over the washed-out ruts of the mountain trail. Every jolt sent a shockwave through the solid oak frame. Godfrey sat hunched forward on the driver's bench, the leather reins threaded loosely through his fingers, letting the two grey mules pick their familiar, agonizingly slow path up the incline. Beside him, Martha took up more than half the bench. Her thigh was pressed firmly against his. There was nowhere else for her to go. The seat simply wasn't built for a woman of her size. Godfrey was hyper-aware of the contact. It had been years since he'd sat this close to a woman who wasn't actively flinching away from him. Her body heat radiated through the rough wool of his trousers, intense and steady. She was gripping the iron railing of the seat with white-knuckled intensity, her heavy arms vibrating with every harsh bump. Her breathing was audible, a slightly labored wheeze as the altitude began to thin the air. He waited for the complaints. The previous brides, the ones who had stayed long enough to endure the wagon ride before demanding to be taken back the next morning, had filled the silence with endless panicked chatter. How much further? Are there bears? Why is it so cold? What is that awful smell? Martha said nothing. She simply braced herself against the violence of the road. A sharp rock caught the left front wheel. The wagon pitched sideways at a terrifying 45-degree angle. Martha's substantial weight shifted, crashing heavily into Godfrey's shoulder. He grunted, bracing his boots against the floorboard to keep them both from tumbling over the side and down the steep, pine-choked ravine. The wagon slammed back down onto 4 wheels. "Sorry," she muttered, shifting her weight back to her side of the bench, though she still touched his hip. She reached down, pulling the fabric of her skirt away from her legs, where it was bunching uncomfortably. "Trail's rough," Godfrey said. The words tasted like dry splinters. He wasn't used to speaking. Silence was his native tongue. "I noticed." She looked out at the sheer drop-off to their right. The tops of 100-foot pines pointed at them like spears. Mules seemed to know the way. "Jack and Barnaby," he offered, instantly regretting giving the animals names. It made him sound soft. "Barnaby favors his left hind," she observed, her voice flat, conversational. "Shoe might be loose, or he's got a stone bruise." Godfrey frowned, looking past the reins. She was right. The mule on the right was stepping light. It irritated him that this city woman had noticed before he did. "I'll check it when we get up," he said defensively. The air grew drastically cooler as they crossed the tree line. The dry, baking heat of Bitter Creek gave way to the sharp, biting scent of pine resin and damp earth. Shadows lengthened, stretching across the trail like dark fingers. Godfrey covertly watched her out of the corner of his right eye. She shivered, her thick arms crossing over her heavy chest. She didn't have a shawl. He considered offering her his wool coat, wadded up behind the seat. He decided against it. She needed to know how brutal this place was. Let the mountain cull the weak. If she was going to run, he wanted her to do it quickly, before he got used to the sound of another human breathing in his cabin. The trees broke, revealing a small, rocky plateau. There sat his cabin. It wasn't a quaint, whitewashed cottage. It was a rugged structure built from unpeeled pine logs, chinked with mud and horsehair. The roof was made of rough cedar shakes, patched in places with tin. A lean-to barn leaned heavily against the harsh wind on the left side. The front yard was nothing but hard-packed dirt and a chopping block stained dark with old blood from slaughtered chickens. Godfrey pulled back on the reins. "Whoa!" The wagon stopped. The silence of the mountain rushed in to fill the space left by the rattling wheels. It was an oppressive, heavy quiet. A hawk shrieked somewhere high above, a lonely, jagged sound. Martha stared at the cabin. She stared at the chopping block. She stared at the solitary, rusted iron bucket sitting near the water pump. Godfrey watched her jaw set. Her fleshy chin doubled as she looked down at the ground. She was doing the math, he figured, calculating the isolation, weighing the rusted reality of this place against whatever desperate situation she had fled back east. "Door's a bit narrow," he said, aiming to twist the knife. She turned her head slowly, looking at his scarred face. Her expression was completely unreadable. "Good thing I can turn sideways," she said. She didn't wait for his help. She climbed down from the wagon, a slow, heavy descent that ended with a solid thud in the dirt. She stretched her back, a loud popping sound echoing in the quiet air, and began walking toward the back of the wagon to retrieve her trunk. The interior of the cabin smelled of old wood ash, cured venison, and deeply ingrained solitude. There was one room, one cast-iron stove, one table with two mismatched chairs, and one bed, tucked tightly into the corner opposite the hearth, covered in a heavy, scratchy buffalo hide. Godfrey lit the oil lamp on the table. The yellow flame flared, casting long, dancing shadows across the log walls. He dragged her massive trunk through the door, his boots scraping loudly against the rough-hewn floorboards. He dropped it at the foot of the bed. "I sleep on the floor," he said abruptly, not looking at her. He pulled a rolled-up canvas cot from beneath the bed frame. "You take the mattress." Martha stood in the center of the room. In the cramped space, her size was even more pronounced. She seemed to take up all the breathable air. She looked at the bed, then at the thin canvas cot. "You've got a bad back," she noted, her eyes dropping to the way he stood, slightly favoring his right side. "Floor won't do it any favors." "I said I sleep on the floor." The sudden harshness in his voice surprised even him. It was a defense mechanism, a wall thrown up to block out the unsettling intrusion of her concern. Martha's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. She unlatched her trunk. The smell of mothballs and dried lavender filled the room. She pulled out a thick, folded woolen blanket and tossed it onto his cot. It landed with a heavy thump. "Nights get cold," was all she said. They ate dinner in a silence so thick it felt like physical pressure. Godfrey had boiled some dried beans and salt pork. It was bland utilitarian food. Martha ate a large portion, chewing methodically, staring at the grain of the wooden table. Godfrey kept his scarred side turned slightly away from her, eating quickly, desperate to escape the proximity. When he blew out the lamp, the darkness brought no relief. The cabin was pitch black, save for the dying orange embers in the stove. Godfrey lay on his cot, the cold seeping through the canvas, biting into his bones. His jaw ached. The scars always tightened when the temperature dropped. He listened to the rustle of the buffalo hide as Martha settled into the bed. She was restless. The wooden slats groaned under her weight as she shifted, trying to find comfort. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling he couldn't see. He knew the script. Tomorrow morning he would wake up, and she would be sitting on the edge of the bed, her trunk repacked, her face pale with terror and regret. She would ask to be taken back down the mountain. He would harness the mules, drive down in silence, hand her back to Cobb, and come back up here alone, just like the others. Let her go. A bitter voice whispered in his head. You don't need a heavy, stubborn woman taking up space. You don't need anyone. Sleep finally claimed him, a shallow, fractured rest filled with dreams of loud explosions and falling rock. When he woke, the cabin was freezing. The grey, anemic light of dawn bled through the single small window. Godfrey opened his good eye, expecting the silence of an empty room. Instead, he heard a loud, metallic clang. He sat up sharply, throwing off the blanket. Across the room, Martha was standing in front of the cast-iron stove. She was wearing a worn, faded flannel wrapper over her nightgown. Her thick, dark hair hung in a loose, messy braid down her back. She was wrestling with the heavy iron door of the firebox, a soot-stained fire poker clutched in her hand. "Damn latch is warped," she muttered, not turning around. She hit the latch with the iron poker. A spark flew, and the door fell open. Godfrey stared. Her trunk was still open at the foot of the bed, contents scattered. She hadn't packed. He swung his legs off the cot, his bare feet hitting the freezing floorboards. "What are you doing?" "Trying to start a fire without freezing to death," she replied, bending over to shove a piece of kindling into the box. The movement highlighted the massive curve of her hips. "You keep your wood too green. It's smoking, not catching." Godfrey stood up, irritated. He walked over, grabbing a piece of dry cedar from the small pile next to the stove. "Move." He expected her to shrink back. Instead, she stood her ground, holding the poker. She was nearly as tall as he was. Her broad chest heaved as she breathed. There was a smear of black soot across her cheek, and her flat brown eyes met his directly. They were close, too close. He could smell the stale sweat of her troubled sleep, mingled with the metallic tang of the cold iron. "I've built fires before, Weaver," she said, her voice a low, steady rumble. "I don't need you to bark at me." Godfrey froze. No one had spoken to him like that in years. People either cowered, pitied him, or patronized him. This woman was doing none of those. She was irritated with his firewood. He stared at her, the tight, scarred half of his face pulling uncomfortably. "You're still here." Martha lowered the poker slowly. She looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the defensive posture, the confusion in his single blue eye, and the grotesque ruin of his cheek. "Where exactly did you think I'd go?" she asked, wiping the soot from her cheek and only managing to smear it further. "I spent my last $3.50 on that train ticket. I have exactly 0 family left in Missouri, and unless you have a hidden fortune under those floorboards, I'm guessing you can't afford to send me back." Godfrey swallowed hard. "Cobb comes back through Bitter Creek tomorrow. I can take you down." Martha let out a short, harsh bark of a laugh. It wasn't a pleasant sound. It was the sound of a woman who had been battered by the world and had no illusions left. "I didn't travel 1,000 miles to turn around because the bed is lumpy and the wood is wet," she said, her voice dropping to a gravelly tone. She jabbed a thick finger toward his chest, stopping just short of touching his shirt. "I told the agency I needed a man who wouldn't drink away the grocery money or hit me when he's angry. Cobb said you don't drink and you keep to yourself." She paused, her eyes flickering over his scars one more time before snapping back to his good eye. "You think you're a monster, Weaver. I've seen monsters. They wear fine suits and smile pretty while they starve you out of your home. You're just a man with a busted face." She turned back to the stove, grabbing the cedar from his hand with a surprisingly strong grip. "Now get out of the way. I brought bacon in my trunk, and I'm hungry." Godfrey stood in the middle of the kitchen, entirely unmoored. The floor beneath his feet felt unsteady. He watched her back as she expertly arranged the dry wood, struck a match against the iron flank of the stove, and coaxed a small, bright flame to life. The scent of burning wood quickly replaced the smell of stale cold. Soon, the sharp, salty aroma of fatback rendering in a hot skillet filled the air. He didn't know what to do with his hands. He rubbed the smooth, dead skin of his jaw. She wasn't running. She was cooking. The profound, quiet shock of it rooted him to the spot. For the first time in 6 years, Godfrey Weaver didn't know exactly what was going to happen next. Summer mornings on the mountain possessed a brutal clarity. Sunlight hit the jagged peaks like a hammer striking an anvil, blinding and sharp. Godfrey stood by the chopping block, bringing a heavy iron maul down onto a stubborn round of oak. Splinters flew, catching the harsh light. Sweat stung his good eye. Every swing pulled at the tight, ruined skin of his left cheek. He usually found solace in this punishing rhythm. Today his focus remained completely shattered. Inside the cabin, pots clattered violently. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, made the floorboards groan in protest. Martha was working. She had been working since the false dawn. Godfrey paused, resting the maul against the wood. Breathing heavily, he wiped his brow with the back of a canvas-gloved hand. He watched the cabin door. She emerged a moment later, hauling a rusted iron wash tub. Water sloshed over the rim, soaking the hem of her faded blue dress. Her face was already flushed, a dangerous mottled crimson. Veins stood out prominently on her thick neck. "Need help with that?" escaped his lips before he could stop the words. Martha dropped the tub onto the hard-packed dirt. Water splashed heavily over his boots. She leaned over, bracing her hands on her massive thighs, gasping for air. Her heavy chest heaved violently. Altitude sickness still clung to her, a persistent thief stealing the oxygen from her lungs. "Did anyone ask for your help, Weaver?" she managed to say between shallow breaths. "Just making an observation," Godfrey muttered, gripping the maul again. "That tub is heavy. You are barely breathing." "Lungs will adjust," she wheezed, straightening her back with a visible wince. "Wash needs doing. Men around here apparently think dirt is a permanent layer of clothing." She turned her broad back to him, marching toward the water pump. Pumping the handle required throwing her entire upper body weight onto the iron lever. Metal shrieked aggressively against metal. Clear water gushed into her wooden pail. She carried it back to the tub, her gait uneven, obviously favoring her left knee. Godfrey struck the oak round with unnecessary force, splitting it clean in two. He hated the tight knot of guilt forming in his gut. He had wanted a sturdy woman, yes, someone to share the crushing burden of survival. Seeing it in practice felt entirely different. Her sheer size made every movement an ordeal. Fat rolled over the tight collar of her dress, glistening heavily with sweat. Chafing had to be agonizing in this blistering heat. Yet she never stopped moving. Hours crawled by, thick with heat and the acrid smell of boiling lye soap. Godfrey mucked the stalls, the pungent ammonia of mule urine burning his nostrils. Barnaby stomped his good hoof, restless and agitated. Godfrey ran a calloused hand over the animal's coarse grey flank, his mind drifting back to the woman in the yard. 4 brides before her had collapsed into hysterics under the weight of this isolation. They hated the silence. They hated the smell of the outhouse. Most of all, they hated looking at him. Martha treated his face like a piece of broken furniture she had to carefully step around. She didn't stare, but she didn't avert her eyes with that sickening, dramatic pity either. She just looked. Lunch consisted of cold bacon and hardtack biscuits. They ate sitting on overturned crates in the shade of the lean-to barn. Flies buzzed relentlessly, landing frequently on the greasy tin plates. "Your pump needs oiling," Martha said abruptly, chewing a tough bite of dry biscuit. "Sounds like a dying calf every time anyone pulls the handle." "We'll get to it later," he replied, chewing on the salted meat. "Can do it myself if you show me where the grease is." She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. Her knuckles were raw, scraped bloody by the aggressive ridges of the washboard. "My hands are already blistered. A little grease won't hurt." Godfrey stared openly at her raw knuckles. Raw skin peeled back, weeping clear fluid. She noticed his intense gaze and curled her hands into loose fists, tucking them into her lap. "Lard is in the tin beside the stove," he said softly, looking away. "Mix it with a little ash from the firebox. Works better than store-bought grease." "Obliged," she grunted. She stood up, the crate shifting precariously under her weight. Her knees popped loudly. She grabbed both their plates, tin clattering sharply together, and headed back to the sweltering cabin. Godfrey watched her go. Wet fabric clung tightly to her damp, broad back. She was entirely devoid of delicate grace, a lumbering force of sheer will. He realized, with a startling jolt of unease, that he was terrified she might actually stay. Twilight draped the mountain in bruised shades of purple and charcoal. Crickets began their frantic evening chorus in the tall bunch grass. Inside the cabin, the oppressive daytime heat finally began to break. Godfrey sat at the small table, a wet oil stone sitting in front of him. He ran the blade of his hunting knife across the grey stone. "Shh, shh." That metallic whisper was soothing, a familiar anchor in a sea of sudden, unwanted changes. Across the room, Martha sat on the edge of the bed. She had changed into her nightgown, a massive tent of white cotton that swallowed her figure entirely. A rusted tin basin sat on the floor at her feet, filled with tepid water. She groaned softly, leaning forward to pull off her thick woolen stockings. Her movements were stiff, laden with profound exhaustion. When those stockings came off, Godfrey's hand froze on the oil stone. Her feet and ankles were horribly swollen. Deep red indentations marked exactly where the tops of her boots had bitten into her flesh. Blisters the size of silver dollars covered both her heels. She plunged her feet into the water with a sharp hiss of pain, her flat eyes squeezing shut. Godfrey forced himself to look back at his knife. Pity was dangerous. Pity led to expectations, and expectations always led to a packed trunk. "Mountain terrain is cruel on flatland boots," he remarked, his words sounding overly harsh in the quiet room. Martha opened her eyes, resting her heavy forearms on her wide knees. "These boots have carried me through a lot worse than dirt and rocks, Weaver. They don't fit right." He tested the edge of his blade with a calloused thumb. "Leather is entirely too stiff. You are cutting your feet to ribbons. They were my brother's," she said, her rough voice dropping a fraction. "Only ones big enough to fit me. Women's boots don't come in my size, not unless someone pays a cobbler custom prices, and I never had that kind of coin." Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Godfrey wiped the blade clean with an oily rag. He sheathed the knife and set it carefully aside. He stood up, walked over to his canvas cot, and pulled a small wooden box from underneath. Returning to the table, he opened the hinged lid. It held an assortment of worn leatherworking tools, an awl, thick waxed thread, a jar of beeswax, and a small razor-sharp curved knife. "Bring them here," he commanded, not looking up as he threaded a heavy needle. Martha hesitated. Water dripped from her swollen feet onto the floorboards. "Bring what? Those boots?" His jaw tightened, scarred tissue pulling his left eye narrower. "Unless you plan on bleeding all over my floor tomorrow." She stared at him for a long, calculating moment. Slowly she lifted her feet from the basin, patting them dry with a rough towel. She grabbed the scuffed, heavy work boots and padded barefoot across the room. She dropped them heavily onto the table. Godfrey picked up the left boot. It was rigid, cheap leather, dried out and badly cracked. He ran his fingers along the inside heel, feeling the sharp ridge where the lining had worn away, exposing stiff, raw hide. Taking his curved knife, he began to slice away the offending ridge. He worked methodically, peeling back thin ribbons of hardened leather with extreme precision. "You don't have to do that," Martha said softly. She stood near the table, her massive presence looming over him. She smelled intensely of lye soap and sweat, a uniquely human scent that made his chest ache inexplicably. "Just need you working," Godfrey lied, keeping his voice entirely flat. "Can't have you crippled up, unable to haul water." "Right." Her tone was dry, completely devoid of belief. "Utilitarian maintenance, like oiling the pump." Godfrey grabbed the jar of beeswax. He scooped out a generous portion with his fingers and began rubbing it aggressively into the stiff leather of the heel, working the wax deep into the pores to soften it. Harsh friction generated heat. His hands were strong, accustomed to punishing manual labor. "Why did you actually come out here?" he asked abruptly. He hadn't planned on asking. He didn't want to know her story. Stories created dangerous attachments. Martha shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Floorboards creaked in loud protest. "Told you before. Ran out of money. Ran out of options. There are jobs in the city. Washerwomen, cooks." He rubbed the wax harder, his knuckles turning stark white. A bitter, exhausted sigh escaped her chapped lips. "Not for women who look like me. People don't want a sweaty giantess serving their food or ruining the aesthetic of their fine parlors. They want small, neat things. I am neither." She reached out, touching the back of the wooden chair. "A baker took me on once back in Missouri. Lasted 2 weeks. His wife told him I was eating all the profits. I wasn't doing any such thing. But when a woman is fat, people assume her appetite matches her size. They see greed. They see a lack of discipline." Godfrey stopped rubbing the boot. He looked up at her. Her face was heavy, deeply lined with years of humiliation she usually hid behind a thick wall of stubborn aggression. Right now, in the dim lamplight, that wall was lowered just a fraction. "Cobb's catalogue," she continued, her voice dropping barely above a whisper. "It promised isolation, a place where nobody would force me to walk past shop windows and see people whispering behind their hands, a place where the actual work mattered more than the packaging." Godfrey looked down at the battered boot in his hands. He understood perfectly. He understood completely. He knew the terrible feeling of eyes sliding away in disgust. He knew the cruel whispers. He knew the crushing weight of existing in a body the world found completely unacceptable. "We'll stretch the toe box tonight," he said, his voice softer than it had been since she arrived. He picked up a wooden shoe stretcher from his box. "Should give your toes some actual room to breathe. Warm wax will soften the heels." Martha watched his scarred hands expertly manipulate the tough leather. "Thank you, Godfrey." Hearing his first name on her lips sent a strange tremor through him. It sounded different coming from her. It didn't sound like a curse or a pitying prayer. It just sounded like a name. "Don't thank me," he mumbled, refusing to meet her brown eyes. "Like I said before, just keeping the livestock moving." Martha didn't argue. She turned around and walked back to the bed, her bare feet silent on the wood. As she settled under the heavy blankets, Godfrey picked up the second boot. He grabbed another handful of beeswax and began to work it into the leather, rhythmic motion filling the quiet cabin. He worked late into the night, watching the fire die down to embers, fighting the terrifying realization that he was beginning to care. August arrived not with a gentle shift in the wind, but with a sudden, suffocating pressure that made the mules pin their ears flat against their skulls. The air tasted sharp, heavily metallic with the scent of ozone and crushed, dry sage. Godfrey stood by the woodpile, wiping a mixture of sweat and sawdust from his forehead. He looked west. A massive, churning wall of purple-black clouds was cresting the jagged ridge, moving with terrifying speed. The underbelly of the storm was a sickly, jaundiced green. Hail. The realization dropped into his stomach like a lead weight. Summer hail at this altitude wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a lethal barrage of jagged ice that could blind a mule or beat a flock of chickens to death in minutes. He threw them all into the dirt. "Martha!" His shout was immediately swallowed by the sudden, violent roar of the wind sweeping down the canyon. It hit the cabin with the force of a physical blow, rattling the tin patches on the roof. He sprinted toward the pasture fencing. Jack and Barnaby were running in panicked, frantic circles, kicking up clouds of grit, completely ignoring the open gate to the lean-to. A heavy figure was already moving across the yard. Martha hadn't waited for his shout. She had abandoned the bucket of potato peelings by the door and was lumbering towards the gate, her broad body leaning aggressively into the gale-force wind. Her heavy skirts whipped violently around her thick legs, a dangerous tangle of faded blue cotton. "Get the chickens!" Godfrey roared over the rising din, reaching the gate just as the first massive drop of freezing water slapped his good cheek. Martha didn't argue. She altered her course, her boots digging hard into the shifting dirt, and headed for the ramshackle wire coop. Godfrey vaulted the low fence. He grabbed Barnaby's halter, digging his heels into the earth. The mule reared, eyes rolling white with terror, lifting Godfrey entirely off his feet for a terrifying second. Godfrey cursed, using his sheer weight to drag the animal's head down. Then the sky broke open. It didn't rain. It unleashed a barrage of solid ice. Hailstones the size of musket balls slammed into the earth, bouncing a foot into the air. One caught Godfrey sharply on the shoulder, a stinging bite that blossomed instantly into a deep bruise. He hauled Barnaby toward the lean-to, shoving the panicked animal into the shadowed safety of the timber frame. He spun around. Jack was still in the open, paralyzed by the punishing ice. Before Godfrey could move, a massive form shoved past him. Martha had two squawking, frantic hens tucked violently under her left arm, pressed tight against her heavy breast. Her right hand reached out and snagged Jack's thick leather halter. "Move, you stubborn bastard!" She bellowed, her rough voice carrying immense volume. The wind tore the pins from her hair. The heavy brown mass came loose, whipping madly across her face. A jagged piece of ice struck her forehead, snapping her head back. She didn't drop the chickens. She didn't let go of the mule. She simply lowered her chin, her face setting into a mask of pure, ugly determination, and physically dragged the terrified 1,000-pound animal forward. Her broad back strained. The fabric of her dress tore at the shoulder seam, exposing a flash of pale, thick skin. She hauled Jack over the threshold of the lean-to, just as the hail intensified into a deafening roar. They stood together in the cramped, manure-scented darkness of the barn. The noise hitting the tin roof was absolute chaos, a mechanical screaming that made conversation utterly impossible. Godfrey leaned against the rough log wall, gasping for air. His lungs burned. He looked at Martha. She was a wreck. She was seated heavily on an overturned feed bucket, her chest heaving violently, struggling to pull oxygen into her altitude-starved lungs. The 2 chickens were still clutched in her lap, rendered completely docile by the shock of the storm. Her hair was plastered to her wet face. A trickle of dark, crimson blood leaked from a cut near her hairline, mixing with the sweat and rain on her cheek. She looked up. Her flat brown eyes met his single blue one in the gloom. She didn't cry. She didn't complain about the cut on her head or the cold tearing through her wet clothes. She just looked down at the ruined hem of her dress, spat a mouthful of dirty rainwater onto the straw-covered floor, and began to forcefully pry the terrified chickens from her lap. Godfrey realized he was staring. He forced his gaze down to his wet boots. His heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, and it had absolutely nothing to do with the storm outside. He had expected her to break. He had built his entire worldview around the absolute certainty that people broke when things got hard. But this massive, sweating, bleeding woman hadn't broken. She had waded into the ice and hauled a panicked mule to safety using nothing but brute force and sheer stubbornness. He reached into his coat pocket, his fingers brushing past a rusted nail, and pulled out a moderately clean rag he used for wiping tools. He walked over to her. The space in the lean-to was tight. He had to stand uncomfortably close. The smell of her wet hair and damp wool filled his nose. He held out the rag. Martha looked at the cloth, then at his hand, and finally at his scarred, tight face. She reached up and took it, her raw, blistered fingers brushing briefly against his calloused knuckles. The brief contact felt like a spark jumping off a hot anvil. "Head is bleeding," he muttered, turning away quickly to check Barnaby's legs. "Ice is sharp," she replied, her voice rough, pressing the rag to her forehead with a heavy sigh. "Storms back in Missouri just bring wind and water. Mountain weather has teeth." "You shouldn't have gone for the mule." He kept his back to her, running his hands down the animal's coarse leg. He would have found his own way in, or he wouldn't. Animals die out here. You don't risk your neck for livestock. I wasn't going to stand in a warm cabin and watch your livelihood get battered to death, Weaver. She snapped, the irritation returning to her voice. And I certainly wasn't going to let you drag both of them in alone while favoring that bad hip of yours. Godfrey stiffened. He hated that she noticed his limp. He hated that she saw the subtle weaknesses he tried so desperately to hide. He didn't reply. They waited out the storm in heavy, suffocating silence, the roar of the hail slowly dying away into a steady, freezing rain, leaving behind a profound shift in the air between them. Mud baked into a rigid, concrete crust on the hem of Martha's dress by the following afternoon. The storm had left behind a humid, oppressive heat that made the mountain air feel thick and unbreathable. Godfrey sat on the porch step, working a thick dollop of saddle soap into a set of broken leather reins. His jaw ached fiercely. The drastic drop in barometric pressure yesterday always caused the burnt nerves in his cheek to fire off in sharp, agonizing spikes. He kept his head down, focusing entirely on the rhythmic, circular motion of his thumbs. He was hyper-aware of the sounds coming from the side yard. Martha was tending the small, pathetic patch of garden he had managed to carve out of the rocky soil. The hail had decimated the young bean plants. She was out there on her hands and knees, meticulously tying broken, battered stems to small wooden stakes, trying to salvage the harvest. Every time she shifted her considerable weight, a low, barely audible grunt of pain escaped her lips. Godfrey stopped rubbing the leather. He listened. There it was again. A sharp intake of breath, followed by a heavy sigh. He stood up, dropping the reins onto the porch boards. He walked around the corner of the cabin. Martha was kneeling in the damp earth. The seam of her dress at the shoulder, torn during yesterday's storm, had ripped further. The skin exposed underneath was an angry, mottled purple. A massive bruise, the size of a dinner plate, covered her left shoulder blade, where a piece of hail, or perhaps a panicked kick from the mule, had struck her. She was trying to reach awkwardly across her massive chest to tie a piece of twine, her left arm trembling visibly from the effort. "Stop!" Godfrey said. Martha froze, her broad back still turned to him. "Beans need propping. Sun will burn the broken stalks." I said stop. He closed the distance between them, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, tilled dirt. "You can't even lift your arm." "I'm managing." She forced her left arm higher. A sharp hiss of pain tore through her teeth, and her arm dropped limply to her side. Godfrey crouched down beside her. The sheer mass of her body blocked out the sun, casting him in deep shadow. "You are useless if you tear a muscle completely. We are 3 days' ride from a doctor, and I am not hauling you down that mountain." The words came out harsher than he intended. It was his default defense mechanism. Whenever the strange, unfamiliar feeling of concern crept into his chest, he suffocated it with cruelty. Martha turned her head slowly. Her face was flushed, coated in a fine layer of dirt and sweat. Her brown eyes were completely devoid of the usual weary tolerance. They were hard. "Don't you dare talk to me like I'm one of your stubborn mules, Godfrey Weaver! Then stop acting like one." He shot back, his scarred cheek pulling tight as he scowled. He reached out, grabbing her left elbow to examine the range of motion. "Don't touch me." She violently jerked her arm away. The sudden movement pulled the damaged muscle in her shoulder. She gasped, her face going pale beneath the dirt, her heavy body swaying dangerously to the side. Godfrey instinctively caught her by her uninjured shoulder, his large hand gripping the thick, damp fabric of her dress to keep her from face-planting into the mud. Her weight was immense, solid, and completely overwhelming. They were frozen like that for 5 agonizing seconds. He was kneeling, holding her up. She was breathing heavily, her face mere inches from his ruined cheek. He could smell the sharp tang of her sweat, the metallic scent of the earth on her hands, and the faint, enduring trace of that lavender soap. He let go of her shoulder as if the cotton dress had suddenly caught fire. He stood up abruptly, taking 3 large steps backward, putting safe, necessary distance between them. "You're a liability!" He spat out, his heart hammering against his ribs. Panic was rising in his throat. He needed her to leave. He needed her to pack her trunk and demand Cobb come get her. Because if she stayed, he would get used to her. And when she eventually realized he was nothing but a broken, ugly man living on a barren rock, her leaving would destroy what little remained of his sanity. "You are entirely too big to be climbing around this terrain. You're too slow. You get hurt doing simple chores. You don't belong out here." Martha didn't scramble to her feet. She stayed on her knees in the mud. She looked at him, her flat eyes taking in the rigid posture, the clenched fists, and the absolute terror bleeding through his single blue eye. She didn't cry. The previous brides had always wept when he yelled. Martha reached down, planted her thick, mud-caked hand squarely on her heavy thighs, and slowly, painfully hauled herself upright. Her knee popped. She stood to her full height, her broad shoulders squared despite the agonizing pain radiating from her back. "You think you're so damn clever, don't you?" Her voice wasn't loud. It was a low, dangerous rumble, far more terrifying than a scream. Godfrey crossed his arms tight over his chest. "I am stating facts. You are stating fears." Martha took a heavy, deliberate step toward him. "You want me to fail. You want me to complain about the heat and cry about the work and beg you to take me back to town." She took another step. Godfrey held his ground, but every instinct screamed at him to back away from the sheer, imposing reality of her anger. "Because if I leave," she continued, her voice grinding like stone on stone, "you get to be right. You get to keep telling yourself that the whole world is cruel and that nobody could ever look at that melted face of yours and see a man worth staying for. You get to remain the miserable, lonely martyr of Bitter Creek." Godfrey felt his breath catch. Nobody had ever spoken to him like this. Nobody had ever stripped away his carefully constructed armor with such brutal, surgical precision. "You don't know anything about me," he growled, the words defensive, weak. "I know that you fixed my boots so I wouldn't bleed," she countered, pointing a thick, dirty finger at his chest. "I know that you gave me the mattress and you sleep on a canvas cot that makes your bad hip ache. I know you're terrified, Godfrey. But I am not one of those frail, terrified girls who took one look at your scars and ran." She stepped right into his space, her massive presence forcing him to look slightly upward to meet her gaze. "I have spent my entire life being told I take up too much space," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I am fat. I am plain. I am exhausted. But I am not weak. And I am not leaving just because you are too much of a coward to let someone share this miserable mountain with you." She held his gaze for a long, suffocating moment, the air heavy with unspoken truths and the sharp sting of reality. Then she turned her back on him. She walked toward the cabin, her gait uneven, her shoulder slumped, leaving Godfrey standing alone in the ruined garden, feeling more exposed and vulnerable than he had ever been in his entire life. September carried a bitter edge, stripping the trees of their softer scents and replacing them with the sharp, metallic tang of impending frost. The morning air burned the lungs. Inside the cabin, a suffocating tension had settled into the log walls since the argument in the mud. They moved around each other like two wary dogs in a cramped cage, calculating every step to avoid collision. Godfrey retreated into a brutal routine of silence. He chopped wood until his palms blistered through his thick leather gloves. He patched the barn roof, driving nails through the tin with an aggressive, punishing rhythm. He wanted to exhaust himself so completely that his mind wouldn't replay her words. "You want me to fail. You are too much of a coward." Martha didn't stop working either. She moved slower, her left arm held stiffly against her heavy ribs, but she never stopped. Godfrey watched her from the corner of his good eye as she hauled the cast-iron skillets to the pump, her thick fingers clumsy and trembling as she scrubbed them with sand. Her shoulder was undeniably getting worse. The purple bruise had spread, creeping up her thick neck, turning a sickening shade of yellow-green at the edges. 3 nights after the storm, Godfrey sat at the small table, grinding dried willow bark in a stone mortar. The grating sound of the pestle filled the quiet room. Martha was sitting on the edge of the bed, her broad back to him. She was trying to unbutton her faded dress with one hand. Her breathing was shallow, punctuated by soft, involuntary hitches of pain as she struggled with the small bone buttons near her collar. He stopped grinding. He stared at her straining back, the heavy curve of her spine visible beneath the worn cotton. Godfrey stood up. He walked to the stove, grabbed a tin cup of hot water, and poured it into the stone mortar, mixing the bitter-smelling powder into a thick, dark paste. He scooped the warm mixture onto a clean strip of cotton cloth. He walked over to the bed. His boots made no sound, but the floorboards betrayed him with a loud creak. Martha froze, her hand dropping from her collar. She didn't turn around. "Take the dress down," Godfrey said. His voice was a harsh rasp, completely devoid of tenderness. It sounded like an order to a field hand. Martha's heavy shoulders stiffened. "I can manage." You can't even reach the buttons, Martha. You're going to tear the muscle clean off the bone." He stood directly behind her. He could smell the stale, sour scent of pain sweat clinging to her skin. "I ground willow bark. It will numb the ache and draw out the swelling. Now take the dress down." A long, agonizing silence stretched between them. The fire in the stove popped loudly, a sharp crack in the heavy air. Slowly, reluctantly, Martha reached up with her good hand and fumbled the last 2 buttons loose. She tugged the collar, letting the heavy fabric slide off her thick shoulders, catching it just above her heavy breasts. Godfrey's breath hitched. Her back was massive, a broad expanse of pale, freckled skin heavily padded with fat. And there, covering her left shoulder blade, was the bruise. It was grotesque. The flesh was swollen, tight, and completely blackened in the center. He didn't hesitate. He stepped closer, bringing the warm poultice to her skin. As the hot, wet cloth made contact with the bruised flesh, Martha let out a sharp, guttural gasp. Her massive frame shuddered violently. Godfrey pressed his large, calloused hand flat against the cloth, holding it firmly in place against her shoulder blade. "Keep still," he muttered. Her skin was incredibly hot. He could feel the heavy, erratic thud of her heart vibrating through her ribs. He stood there, his chest inches from her bare back, pressing the poultice into her swollen flesh. He had expected revulsion. He had expected to feel disgust at her sheer size. Instead, he felt an overwhelming, crushing sense of solidity. She felt like the mountain itself, battered, weathered, but entirely immovable. "You smell like sawdust and horse sweat," Martha rasped, her voice thick, staring straight ahead at the log wall. "You smell like lie and stubbornness," Godfrey replied instinctively. A sudden, startling sound broke the quiet. It was a laugh. It was a rough, wheezing, entirely unladylike chuckle that shook Martha's heavy frame and made Godfrey press harder on the poultice to keep it in place. "Suppose we're a matched pair of ruined things, then," she murmured, the fight finally draining out of her voice. Godfrey looked down at his own scarred, tight knuckles resting against her pale, bruised skin. He swallowed hard against the tight lump forming in his throat. He didn't pull his hand away. "Suppose we are," he said to the quiet room. Jaden Cobb drove his buckboard wagon into the yard 3 weeks later. The early November air was vicious, freezing the mud into hard, jagged ruts. Cobb's mules blew thick white plumes of breath through their nostrils, stomping their hooves impatiently on the frozen earth. Godfrey was by the chopping block, splitting dry cedar. The sharp crack of the axe echoed off the canyon walls. He lowered them all, his single blue eye narrowing as Cobb wrapped the reins around the brake lever and climbed down, his heavy coat bundled tight around his greasy neck. "Mornin', Weaver," Cobb called out, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He rubbed his gloved hands together, his eyes darting towards the cabin door. "Brought the stage up to the crossing. Figured I'd make the trek up here before the pass snows over completely." Godfrey didn't move. He leaned on the handle of his maul. "You're early. Mail doesn't run till next week." Cobb let out a short, nervous laugh. He kicked a frozen clump of dirt with his boot. "Ain't here for the mail, Weaver. Figured the Chavez woman would be packed and ready. Always are by the time the first hard freeze sets in. Got room in the back for that massive trunk of hers." The cabin door creaked open. Martha stepped out onto the porch. She was wearing a heavy, oversized canvas coat that used to belong to Godfrey. The sleeves rolled up twice to free her thick wrists. She held a large, rusted iron skillet in her right hand, a rag wrapped around the hot handle. She stood at the top of the stairs, her sheer size dominating the space. She looked at Cobb, then at the empty bed of his wagon, and finally at Godfrey. "Something the matter, Mr. Cobb?" she asked, her voice carrying easily over the cold wind. It wasn't friendly. It was the low rumble of an avalanche waiting to detach. Cobb took a step back, visibly startled by her presence. He looked her up and down, a sneer curling his thin lips. "Just doing my job, Miss Chavez. Figured a woman of your delicate constitution wouldn't want to winter up here with a half-faced hermit. Got a seat waiting for you on the eastbound train." Godfrey felt the familiar, ugly rage flare in his chest. His hand tightened on the axe handle until his knuckles turned white. He opened his mouth to tell Cobb to get off his property, to threaten the man with the very maul he held. Before he could speak, Martha descended the stairs. Each heavy footfall landed with a solid thud against the frozen earth. She didn't look at Godfrey. She walked straight toward Jaden Cobb. She stopped 3 feet from him, crossing her thick arms over her chest, the hot iron skillet resting casually against her heavy hip. She looked down at the broker, her flat brown eyes entirely devoid of fear or shame. "I bought a return ticket with my own blood and blisters these past 3 months, Cobb," Martha said, her voice dropping an octave. "I chopped the wood, I patched the roof, and I butchered the hogs. This mountain is just as much mine as it is his now." Cobb bristled, his face flushing red beneath his dirt-smudged cheeks. "Now listen here, you stubborn cow. Shut your mouth!" Godfrey barked. His voice cracked like a rifle shot across the yard. He dropped the maul. It hit the frozen ground with a heavy clang. He walked over, stepping out of the shadows, intentionally turning his fully scarred, melted profile toward the broker. He stood right beside Martha. Their shoulders brushed. For the first time, he didn't pull away from the contact. He leaned into it. "You heard my wife," Godfrey said, the words tasting strange and heavy on his tongue. "We don't need a ride back east. And if you ever bring a wagon up my mountain expecting to haul her away again, I'll use your mules for target practice." Cobb stared at them. He looked at Godfrey's ruined face, a twisted landscape of burnt flesh and tight scars. Then he looked at Martha's massive, imposing frame, her face hardened by years of cruel mockery and harsh labor. He shook his head, a mixture of disgust and disbelief twisting his features. "You two deserve each other," Cobb spat, turning on his heel. "Freaks! The both of you!" He scrambled up onto the wagon bench, whipped the reins violently against the mules' backs, and cursed as the wagon jolted forward, rattling loudly down the frozen trail until it disappeared behind the tree line. The silence rushed back in, heavy and biting. Godfrey stood absolutely still. The adrenaline was draining from his blood, leaving him feeling hollow and exposed. He had called her his wife. The catalog contract was just a piece of paper, a legal fiction they had both ignored. But saying it out loud to an outsider made it terrifyingly real. He slowly turned his head to look at her. Martha was staring down the empty trail. The wind whipped her loose brown hair across her flushed face. She didn't look angry anymore. She looked profoundly tired, but deeply rooted. She turned to face him. She didn't mention the word wife. She didn't ask for a romantic declaration. She reached out with her free hand, her knuckles red, raw, and scarred from the washboard, and gently pressed her thick fingers against the tight, ruined skin of his left cheek. Godfrey flinched purely out of instinct, his breath hitching, but she didn't pull away. Her touch was warm, heavy, and completely unflinching. She traced the edge of the deepest scar near his jawline, her flat brown eyes looking directly into his single blue one. "Coffee's getting cold on the stove, Godfrey," she said softly, dropping her hand back to her side. Godfrey let out a long, shaky breath, the tight knot of terror in his chest finally, irrevocably unraveling. He looked at the heavy, stubborn, magnificent woman standing in his freezing yard. "I'll bring the wood in," he replied. They turned and walked back toward the cabin together, two battered shapes moving in slow, heavy synchronization against the biting winter wind, closing the door firmly against the cold world outside. If this gritty, grounded tale of two imperfect souls finding their anchor in the unforgiving Wild West moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Smash that like button to show your support. Share this video with someone who appreciates real, raw storytelling, and hit subscribe to ensure you never miss our next deep dive into the rugged frontier of the human heart. Leave a comment below. Who was your favorite character?